The year was 1944, but the memory would echo for a lifetime. Snow fell unevenly across the barbed wire of Stalag Luft III, drifting like silent ash. Inside Barrack 17, under the flicker of a dying lantern, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Hale whispered a sentence that made the room go still. "When this war ends, I'm coming back for you." He said it to no one at first, only to the wooden wall, carved with dates and names of men who never returned. But then he turned his head, meeting the eyes of the only prisoner who still believed escape was possible, a thin, frostbitten Belgian engineer named Luc Marceau. Both men knew the truth. No promises survived long in a German POW camp. Every morning, prisoners vanished, transferred, shot, or broken beyond recognition. Every night, the guards dragged shivering bodies past the barracks without slowing down. And yet Hale repeated the vow again, softer but sharper. "If we're separated, I'll find you, even if it takes the rest of my life." The camp erupted hours later. Sirens, boots, dogs, commands. A sudden transfer order tore the two men apart. Hale was marched into the dark, Luke left behind with nothing except 7 words. He promised he would return. Most POWs made silent wishes. Hale made a vow. What no one in that camp knew, what no one could know, was that this promise would survive the march, the liberation, the decades, and eventually lead to a discovery so unbelievable that historians dismissed it as myth. Until the documents surfaced. The war had already stretched across 5 relentless years. By January 1944, Europe felt like it had aged a century. Villages were little more than chimneys. Cities, once loud, crowded, living, had become echo chambers of broken stone. Armies moved across maps like storms no one could outrun. And hidden within this chaos were the camps. Stalag Luft III, located in the pine forests of Silesia, was one of the most heavily guarded POW compounds the Germans had built. Designed to hold captured Allied airmen, it was a world with its own rules, its own rituals, and its own quiet, suffocating dread. Inside the perimeter, time didn't move forward. It circled, day after day, ration after ration, roll call after roll call. Thomas Hale arrived there with a limp and a stubbornness some mistook for arrogance. He had been an RAF pilot, the kind who believed in precision, discipline, and the unspoken bond between men who shared a cockpit silence. His plane had been shot down during a night raid over the Ruhr. Luc Marceau, by contrast, was not a soldier at all. He was a civilian engineer captured while helping the Belgian resistance sabotage a railway line. What he lacked in military training, he made up for in stubborn courage. Their paths should never have crossed. But the war had no respect for should or shouldn't. Life in Stalag Luft III wasn't defined by violence, not the immediate kind. It was defined by pressure. A pressure that pressed into the bones. The sort that made grown men sit awake at night, wondering not if they would die, but whether anyone would remember them if they did. Each morning, prisoners lined up for appel, roll call, in the freezing mud. German guards walked past counting heads, their voices flat, mechanical. Then came the long hours, repairing uniforms, trading scraps of food, telling stories to stay sane. Some men dug tunnels. Others carved chess pieces. A few simply stared at the fence, as if memorizing every knot in the wire could grant them freedom. Hale observed everything. He memorized guard routes, ration times, weather changes. Luke watched him. That was how their friendship began. Quietly, without grand gestures, built from scraps of conversation and the shared need to believe the world outside still existed. The German officers considered Hale a troublemaker, a man too organized, too alert. They weren't wrong. He had attempted escape twice already. Not out of recklessness, out of principle. When he promised Luke that he would return, it wasn't bravado. It was the same cold, steady certainty with which he flew missions. But the camp wasn't just a prison. It was a sieve through which men slowly filtered. Transfers, punishments, secret investigations, medical removals. One week you played cards with a man. The next week his bunk was empty. Hale knew a transfer was coming. What he didn't expect was how sudden and severe it would be. Just before dawn one morning, guards stormed the barracks and lined up several prisoners. Hale felt the rifle, but before he heard his name, Luke reached out instinctively, but the guards shoved him back. For a moment, just one, Hale looked over his shoulder. A promise passed between them again. Then the column moved, and Luke was left behind. The convoy that dragged Thomas Hale from Stalag Luft III moved like a wound across the forest, boots crunching ice, chains clattering, prisoners coughing through the cold. No one knew the destination. Transfers during 1944 rarely meant anything good. Camps were overcrowded. Resources were shrinking. The Germans were growing paranoid, unpredictable, desperate. Hale walked with his wrists tied, eyes forward, mind burning. He wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of becoming another name carved into a barrack wall, erased before he could keep his word. The transport train they were loaded into was a cattle wagon. Wooden slats, a rusted lock, one small hole for air. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder, the smell of pine mixing with sweat and frostbite. As the doors slammed shut, Hale understood something immediately. This wasn't an ordinary transfer. The journey lasted hours, then days. Men fainted. Others prayed. Some simply drifted into silence they never returned from. Hale counted the rattles of the tracks, trying to map their direction. West? No. South? Possibly. Every turn, every halt burned into his memory. When the train finally stopped, the doors opened to a new kind of nightmare. Breslau, a transit camp far harsher than Stalag Luft III. This facility wasn't designed to hold organized squadrons of Allied pilots. It was a chaos of prisoners, soldiers, civilians, partisans, political dissidents, even teenagers, shoved together under the rule of officers who viewed them as disposable. Hale was stripped, searched, and assigned to a labor detachment responsible for clearing debris after Allied bombings. Each day, he walked through streets where buildings leaned like broken bones, where the air tasted of brick dust and fear. Every evening he returned to the barracks with cuts on his hands and anger in his jaw. Luke, meanwhile, remained in Stalag Luft III, alone, growing weaker, repeating Hale's promise under his breath like a prayer he didn't fully believe. But the war outside was changing faster than either man knew. By late 1944, the Eastern Front was collapsing. Soviet forces were pushing westward with terrifying speed. Germany began rushing prisoners away from any area that might fall to the Red Army. Rumors spread like smoke. Forced evacuations, death marches, entire camps emptied overnight. Hale felt the shift before anyone said it aloud. Supply rations shrank. Guards grew restless. The officers began burning documents. Then, one night, a German sergeant stepped into the barracks and shouted orders that chilled everyone awake. Pack what you can carry. 5 minutes. No explanation. No destination. Just a row of rifles at the door. It was the beginning of what historians would later call the Breslau Winter March, a brutal, freezing trek that killed hundreds of prisoners before they even crossed the first river. Hale marched with bleeding feet, trying to keep men upright, forcing himself not to think of Luke waiting somewhere behind miles of pine forest and war-torn rail lines. His promise was a knife in his chest, sharp enough to keep him alive. Every village they passed held traces of retreat. Burned trucks, abandoned artillery, German civilians hauling carts of belongings toward the west. The freezing wind carried the distant rumble of Soviet artillery. On the third night, a prisoner collapsed beside Hale. The guards shot him without slowing their pace. By dawn of the fourth day, frostbite had turned Hale's fingertips gray. He couldn't feel his boots. His breath came in sharp, metallic bursts. He stumbled but forced himself upright. He could not die. Not here. Not yet. He repeated the promise in his mind. I'll return for you, even if it takes the rest of my life. It became the rhythm of his feet, the heartbeat that kept him moving. Then, on the 7th morning of the march, fate shifted. The column halted. Guards argued. Some shouted. Others pointed south. And then, gunfire. Not German. Not Allied. Chaotic, close, erupting around them. The line of prisoners scattered as bullets tore into nearby trees. Somewhere in the madness, a guard screamed, "Partisans!" Another yelled for reinforcements. Hale hit the ground, crawled behind a ditch, and felt the ice sting his skin. When he lifted his head, he saw something impossible. The guards were retreating, abandoning the march, running. For the first time in months, the prisoners were unguarded. Hale pushed himself up. His legs trembled. His lungs burned. But he was free. And the first thought that surged through him, more powerful than hunger, exhaustion, or fear, was Luke. Somewhere out there, buried in the war's shifting geography, in a camp that might already be abandoned or destroyed, was the man he had sworn to return to. The world was collapsing. Armies were colliding. Borders were dissolving. But Hale walked in one direction, toward the promise. Hale staggered south through the wreckage of a country tearing itself apart. No maps. No supplies. No winter gear. Only instinct, memory, and a promise that refused to die. Behind him, the echoes of the abandoned march faded into the forest. Ahead of him lay a continent collapsing under its own weight. Columns of refugees, broken roads, burned farms, and cities swallowed by smoke. But Hale's path cut through all of it, straight toward Stalag Luft III. He didn't know if Luke was alive. He didn't know if the camp still stood. He only knew he hadn't come this far to fail. By the time Hale crossed into Silesia, the temperature had dropped even further. His feet bled through the soles of scavenged boots. His hands were a mess of frostbite and torn skin. More than once he collapsed beside the road, only to drag himself up again, repeating Luke's name like a compass. 2 days into his journey, he encountered a group of Polish farmers hiding in a barn. They fed him boiled potatoes and gave him a threadbare coat. When they learned he was heading towards Stalag Luft III, they exchanged grim looks. One of them finally spoke. The Germans. They emptied the camp. Days ago. The prisoners marched west. Hale felt something inside him crack, but not break. If Luke had been marched west, that meant he was still alive somewhere. Still moving. Still hoping. Hale thanked the farmers and pushed on. Every step became a gamble against the cold, the war, and time itself. Then, one afternoon, he reached the forest clearing where Stalag Luft III once stood. The camp was gone. Not dismantled. Not abandoned. Burned. Charred posts jutted from the snow like blackened teeth.
Barracks kollapset, Rufsfallen inward.
The watchtowers were skeletal, melted by flames. The ground was littered with ash, twisted metal, and scorched fragments of belongings the prisoners had been forced to leave behind. Hale walked through the ruins in numb silence. This was where Luke had lived, where he had waited, where that promise had been spoken into the cold air between two desperate men. Hale knelt in the center of the camp and sifted through the snow until his fingers closed around a piece of wood. A fragment of a bunk. On it, faintly burned but still visible, was a carved name. Mark. Half the letters were missing. But he didn't need the rest. Luke had carved it. Luke had survived long enough to make this mark. Hale closed his eyes. He could almost hear the men counting days, whispering their names to the walls so the world wouldn't forget them. He rose with a new certainty vibrating through him.
Luke was alive.
Somewhere on that death march, freezing, starving, but alive. Hale set off west. He followed abandoned roads, broken fences, and fading footprints carved by thousands of prisoners forced into the winter. He slept in barns, ditches, and once under an overturned wagon. His body began to fail, blisters splitting, fever creeping into his bones, but his will hardened. He passed villages devastated by retreat, fields littered with destroyed convoy trucks, crossroads where German guards had abandoned boots, helmets, and rifles as they fled. Everything told the same story: chaos, retreat, desperation. And then, on a fog-choked morning near a frozen riverbank, he saw them. A line of men, thin, ragged, barely walking. Their striped uniforms hung like rags. Some leaned on sticks, others on each other. A handful of German guards marched beside them, their discipline gone, their formation broken. A death march. Hale felt his heart slam against his ribs. He approached slowly, keeping to the trees, scanning every face. Some prisoners stumbled. Some whispered prayers. Some stared blankly at the ground, already half gone from this world. Then, a familiar shape. Smaller now, thinner. But the posture, the tilt of the head, the stubborn lift of the chin. Luc. Hale stepped out from the trees. For a moment, the world narrowed to two men standing in the doorway of death. Luc blinked, unsure if the figure before him was real or a fever dream. Hale's face was gaunt, bruised, half-frozen. But the eyes, sharp, alive, unbroken, were unmistakable.
Luc whispered, barely audible.
Thomas, you came back. Hale swallowed, voice hoarse from cold and days of silence. I promised, didn't I? The guards shouted, rifles rising. Hale didn't flinch. Because in that moment, after marches, ruin, fire, and a vow carried through a dying world, he had found the man he swore to return for. For a moment the world froze. Hale, Luc, the guards, the prisoners, all suspended in a silence far colder than the winter air. Then chaos moved first. A German guard barked an order, raising his rifle. The others hesitated, glancing at each other with the hollow eyes of men who no longer believed in the war they were fighting. Hale lifted his hand slowly, stepping toward Luc, placing himself between his friend and the rifles pointed their way. But fate had one more turn left. The distant rumble of engines cut through the stillness. Not German. The guards heard it too. Their fear was instant and unmistakable. A Soviet reconnaissance unit crested the ridge behind the march. The guards ran, dropping rifles, helmets, anything that weighed them down. They scattered into the trees like shadows terrified of the dawn. The prisoners, too weak to cheer, simply collapsed into the snow, letting exhaustion swallow them. Hale caught Luc before he fell. Luc was a trembling weight in his arms, bones wrapped in skin, breath shallow, eyes wet not from weakness, but because a vow made in the darkest of places had just been kept. The Soviets reached them minutes later. Confusion. Shouting. Medic tents erected in haste. Bread handed out to hands that shook too violently to hold it. Hale and Luc were carried together into a field station, wrapped in coarse blankets, their bodies steaming in the sudden warmth. Days passed before Hale could walk again. Weeks before Luc regained his strength. They were separated again briefly. Hospital wards, treatment lines, paperwork, but not by force this time. Not by war. And not for long. After the war ended, both men returned home, Hale to England, Luc to Belgium. Life tried to scatter them again, as life often does. New cities. New jobs. Families. Quiet routines replacing the noise of war. But some bonds refused to fade. Every year, on the anniversary of the camp's liberation, Hale sent Luc a letter. Sometimes long, sometimes only a single sentence. Luc always replied. Decades passed. In 1981, Hale visited Belgium. The two men, once prisoners, once marchers through hell, met again on a quiet street lined with spring blossoms. Hale was slower now, his hair silver. Luc's hands shook when he lifted them. They embraced without words. Two old men. Two survivors. Two lives that existed because a promise, made in a barrack carved with names of the forgotten, had been impossible to break. Hale died in 1994. In his will, he left one request. Scatter a part of my ashes near the ruins of Stalag Luft III. He will know why. Luc did. He stood alone in the clearing where the camp once stood, the air still, the ground silent. He opened the small urn and let the ashes drift into the wind. In the end, Luc whispered, you kept your word. The forest didn't answer. It didn't need to. Because in the quiet that followed, the world remembered everything.